Clara Whitfield counted the blows, the way other women counted blessings quietly. In the dark so nobody could hear. 411 nights. She had stopped screaming after the first 6 months, because screaming made him hit harder. And she had stopped crying after the first year, because tears made him feel powerful. And she had stopped praying after the second, because God, apparently, had other business in Red Creek, Texas. But the night Harlan's boot connected with her ribs and she heard something crack, the night she tasted blood and looked up from the floor and saw him holding her father's deed with a lit match, Clara Whitfield stopped counting and started planning. Before we go any further, if this story already has your heart, please subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Clara Whitfield had a system. She knew exactly which floorboards in the front hallway creaked. She knew which hinges on the back door would groan if you didn't lift the handle before turning it. She knew that if Harlan's boots hit the porch before sundown, the evening would be survivable. If they hit after dark, she needed to already be invisible, already in the kitchen with supper on the table. Already small, already sorry for things she hadn't even done yet. 3 years of marriage had taught her that survival was a skill. Same as canning tomatoes or mending fence line. You learned it or you didn't make it. She had learned it well, but the morning she walked into Sheriff Burl Calloway's office with Boyd Garrett's forged deed balled up in her fist and her bottom lip swollen to twice its size, Clara wasn't running her system anymore. The system had broken down the previous night when she'd found the paperwork tucked inside Harlan's coat pocket, the paperwork that proved her husband hadn't just been hitting her for 3 years. He'd been selling her too, piece by piece, the north pasture, the creek rights, the timber acreage her father had died to hold on to. All of it, signed away to Boyd Garrett's land company in exchange for a cut of the swindle and a handshake sealed with whiskey. She'd stood in the dark of the bedroom with that deed in her hands while Harlan slept 4 feet away. And something inside her had gone absolutely, irreversibly still. Not scared, not even angry. Just done. The sheriff's office smelled like pipe tobacco and old coffee. Sheriff Calloway sat behind his desk with his boots up and his hat over his face. And when the door opened, he pushed the brim up with one finger and looked at her the way men in Red Creek had been looking at Clara Whitfield since she was 17 years old, the half-second flicker of surprise at her size. The quick reassessment, the unconscious decision about how much of her words to take seriously. She was used to it. She set the deed on his desk. "I need you to look at that," she said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. Calloway sat up slowly. He was a big man himself, thick through the chest, with a gray mustache that he'd been growing since before Clara was born. He picked up the deed, squinted at it, set it back down. "Where'd you get this?" Harlan's coat. Something shifted in his expression. Not sympathy exactly. More like the specific discomfort of a man who already knows what's being told to him and would sincerely prefer not to. "Clara, my father built that ranch," she said. "He built it before Red Creek had a post office, before it had a church. My mother planted every fruit tree on that property, and she's buried under the biggest one. That deed is forged. Boyd Garrett doesn't own our creek rights. He never did." Calloway looked at the document again. He looked at her lip. "Did Harlan do that to your face?" "He does that to my face regularly," Clara said. "But right now I'm asking you about the deed." The sheriff set the paper down and pulled at his mustache and stared at the middle distance for a long moment. Then he said, "Boyd Garrett's a powerful man in this county. I know that. And Harlan Whitfield is your husband. I know that too. Clara, I'm not sure what you expect me to. I expect you to do your job," she said. And her voice didn't shake, and she didn't apologize for saying it. And she watched something flicker across Calloway's face that she couldn't quite read. She'd grown up not being taken seriously. She'd grown up being the girl who was too big, too plain-spoken, too much of everything the women in Red Creek were supposed to be less of. She'd grown up being told she was lucky when Harlan Whitfield had come asking her father for her hand. Because what other offers was a girl like her likely to get? She had believed it. God help her, she had believed it. And she had married him, and then the first time his fist connected with her jaw on a Tuesday evening 6 weeks into their marriage. She had believed that too, believed the part afterward, when he cried and said it would never happen again. Believed the part when he said she'd provoked him. Believed the part eventually, when she started thinking maybe she deserved it. 3 years. She was 23 years old, and she had spent 3 years believing she deserved it. Standing in Calloway's office with the deed on his desk and the taste of blood still on her lip, she didn't believe it anymore. "I'll look into it," the sheriff said finally. And the way he said it told her he would do nothing of the kind. She picked up the deed. "Then I'll find someone who will," she said. And she walked back out into the Texas sun, Red Creek. Texas, in the summer of 1887, was not a town that kept its cruelty quiet. It was a small town in the particular way that small towns could be merciless, everyone knowing everyone. Everyone watching everyone, the social architecture of the place built on a foundation of comparison and judgment that had been laid down before most of its current residents were born. Clara had grown up in it. She knew every layer of it. She knew which women would smile at her face and whisper behind her back. She knew which men would tip their hats in public and make fat jokes over poker on Saturday nights. She knew, too, that her size had been the central fact of her existence in this town, since she was old enough to understand that she was different from what the town considered acceptable. She was not small. She had never been small. At 23, she was round and full-figured in a way that the women of Red Creek described with words like unfortunate and such a pretty face, though that particular cruelty of the qualifier. The compliment offered like a consolation prize for a contest she hadn't entered. She had her father's eyes, dark brown, almost black, with a steadiness to them that people sometimes found unsettling because they expected someone who looked like Clara to look down more. She had her mother's hands, broad, capable hands that could gentle a spooked horse or knead 3 loaves of bread without breaking a sweat. She had a mind that worked faster than most people in Red Creek gave her credit for, which had been both her secret weapon and her source of loneliness for as long as she could remember. Harlan had known about the mind. That was why he'd worked so hard to convince her it was worthless. She was walking back down the main street toward the livery, where she'd left her horse when she heard it, the low, deliberate murmur that she recognized from long practice as the sound of people discussing her within earshot on purpose. 2 women standing outside the dry goods store.
Mrs.
Hadley and her daughter-in-law, Priscilla, who wore her prettiness like a weapon and used it accordingly. "Went into the sheriff's office looking like that," Priscilla was saying, not bothering to lower her voice. "You'd think she'd have the sense to stay home." "Well, Mrs." Hadley's tone had that particular texture of someone pretending to be sympathetic while being anything but. When a woman can't keep a husband content, she tends to look for trouble elsewhere. "She can't keep him content," Priscilla said. And there was a smile in it, because look at her. Clara kept walking. She was good at that. She had practiced it for 3 years. You kept your eyes ahead and your chin level, and you let the words move through you, like wind through grass. And you told yourself it didn't touch you, and mostly you believed it. She was almost to the livery when a voice behind her said, "Ma'am, pardon me." She turned around because the voice was unfamiliar. And in a town the size of Red Creek, unfamiliar voices were rare enough to register. He was standing at the edge of the water trough, holding his horse's reins loose in one hand. Tall, genuinely tall, not just tall seeming, with the kind of build that came from decades of physical work rather than the gym-built thickness of the town's younger men who wanted to look strong. His hat was pushed back on his head, and his dark hair had the look of someone who'd been riding since before dawn. He had a beard that wanted trimming and eyes the color of creek water in October gray-green. deep, with a quality of attention in them that Clara found immediately disorienting. He wasn't looking at her body. He was looking at her face. More specifically, at her lip. "I'm not trying to get in your business," he said. And his voice was low and unhurried, the cadence of a man who chose his words carefully and meant the ones he used. "But I saw you come out of the sheriff's office, and I saw Calloway's face through the window when you left." He paused. "He's not going to help you." Clara studied him for a moment. She had learned, over the years, to be careful with strangers offering concern. Concern could be a doorway to things worse than indifference. "I figured that out myself," she said. "Thank you." "Yes." Man at once, respectful and unhurried. "The name's Caleb Dawson. I'm working a cattle drive up through Garrett County this week. But I've ridden through Red Creek before, and I know Boyd Garrett's name, and I know what his paper operations look like." He reached up and touched the brim of his hat. "If that deed you're carrying is what I think it is, you're going to need a land attorney, not a sheriff. There's one in Hargrove man named Sutton. He's honest." "That's rarer than it sounds." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why are you telling me this?" The question came out more direct than she'd intended. But she was 23 years old, and she had spent 3 years learning that people did not offer things without wanting something in return. And she was done being surprised by that lesson. Caleb Dawson considered the question with what appeared to be genuine seriousness rather than offense. "Because you walked out of that office carrying something heavy," he said. "And you held your head up while you did it. And because I've seen Boyd Garrett's operation take 3 ranches in the last 2 years, and the people who lost them didn't have anyone to point them toward Sutton in time." He shrugged. One small movement of those wide shoulders seemed like a waist. "Is all." Clara didn't say anything for a moment. Around them, Red Creek moved through its afternoon business, the clang of the smithy, the rattle of a wagon on the main road, the distant sound of someone's argument spilling out of the saloon. Ordinary sounds. The sounds her life had run underneath for 3 years, like a current nobody could see. "I'll write down the name for you," Caleb said, "if you've got paper." She found a scrap in her coat pocket. He wrote the name and the town in handwriting that was plain and clear. And he handed it back without making her reach for it. "Thank you, Mr. Dawson," she said. "Ma'am." He touched his hat again. Then, carefully, the way someone might mention a thing they've been trying to decide whether to mention. "You got somebody who can keep him off you tonight? While you figure out your next step?" The bluntness of it should have stung. Coming from a stranger, it should have felt like exactly the kind of exposure she spent her life protecting against. But there was something in the way he asked it factual, concerned, with no pity in it, and no prurience either, that made it land differently. "I can handle my own situation," she said. "I don't doubt it," he said immediately. And he meant it. She could hear that he meant it. "I'm just asking." "I have a neighbor," she said after a moment. "Mrs. Pearce. She's elderly, but she's got 2 sons. Caleb nodded. "Good." He gathered his horse's reins and prepared to move on. Then he stopped. "Miss?" He corrected himself. "Mrs. Whitfield. Whatever Calloway said to you in there. Or didn't say. Whatever this town has said to you." His gray-green eyes were steady and direct. "You walked in there with evidence of a crime against your property and your person, and you demanded that somebody do something about it. You're not wrong for doing that. You're just in the wrong sheriff's office." He rode on before she could answer. Clara stood at the edge of the livery for a long moment, the scrap of paper in her hand, and felt something move through her chest that she couldn't immediately name. It wasn't hope exactly. Hope had a lightness to it. And this was heavier, more like the feeling of a door being unlocked from the inside. The particular sensation of something that has been shut for a very long time beginning slowly to open. She didn't go home that afternoon. She went to Mrs. Pearce's place instead, which sat on the eastern edge of the Whitfield property, where the fence line met the old cottonwood grove. Nora Pearce was 71 years old and had outlasted 2 husbands. 4 cattle diseases, and a flash flood that had taken her barn down to the foundation. And she greeted Clara's split lip with the specific economy of a woman who had seen enough of the world to not pretend. "Sit down. I'll get the arnica." Clara sat at Nora's kitchen table, which was the most reliable safe surface in her world, the place she'd come to 3 times before in 3 years. Always at night, always with something broken or bleeding. Nora had never asked unnecessary questions. She'd never told anyone. She'd fed Clara soup and given her the eastern bedroom, and in the morning let Clara decide. Always what happened next. "It's different this time," Clara said. Nora set the arnica tin on the table and sat across from her. "Tell me." Clara laid out the deed. She explained what she'd found, what she'd done, what Calloway had said and hadn't said. She told Nora about Caleb Dawson and the name on the scrap of paper. Nora listened with her hands folded on the table, and her face absolutely still. When Clara finished, Nora said, "Your father would be proud of you." Clara's throat tightened. "My father would tell me to go home and stop making trouble." "No," Nora said, with a quiet certainty. "Your father was a man who built something from nothing because he believed it was worth building. He would look at what you're doing right now, and he would say, 'You have more of him in you than you ever knew.'" She reached across and put one weathered hand over Clara's. "He also would say that Harlan Whitfield is going to come looking for you when he finds that deed is gone. I know. My boys can sleep in the barn tonight. I don't want to bring this to your door." "You didn't bring it," Nora said firmly. "It followed you. And I'm not asking." Clara looked at the old woman's face. The lines of it, the absolute unshakable quality of her, and felt that loosening in her chest again, that slow, unfamiliar unlocking. "Mrs. Pearce," she said quietly, "do you think I should have left before now?" The question had been living inside her for 3 years. A small cold weight she carried in the space below her sternum. She had never said it out loud before. She wasn't entirely sure why she was saying it now, except that the morning had somehow cracked her open, and the question had come out with everything else. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think you did what you knew how to do with what you had. And I think knowing something different is possible is only useful when you actually know it." She squeezed Clara's hand once. "You know it now." Harlan arrived at Nora's property just before sunset. Clara heard the horse before she saw him, heard the heavy, irregular rhythm of it, which told her he'd been in the saloon. She was sitting on Nora's porch and she did not go inside. She sat still and watched him ride up to the gate and stop. He looked at her from the saddle. He was not a small man either. Harlan Whitfield was broad through the chest, thick-necked, with a boyish face that had always struck the women of Red Creek as handsome and had always struck Clara, by the 3rd year, as something that had learned how to arrange itself into handsomeness the way a card player learned to arrange his face. "Clara," he said. His voice was careful. She recognized that register, the one he used when he was calculating his approach. "Come on home now." "No," she said, one word. She had practiced saying it in her head for 3 years. It was smaller than she expected and sturdier. Harlan's expression shifted. "Clara, I know you're upset. You sold the North Pasture," she said. "You sold the creek rights. You forged my name on Boyd Garrett's papers, and you've been taking payments for 2 years, and you never told me." The calculation in his face went still. Behind the stillness was something harder, and she recognized that too. "You went through my things," he said. "You sold my family's land." "It's my land," he said. And his voice dropped into that low range that had preceded every bad night for 3 years. "You are my wife, and what you have is mine, and you'd do well to remember, Nora," Clara said, without raising her voice, and from inside the house came the sound of a door opening. And Nora's eldest son, Thomas, appeared at the corner of the porch with his arms crossed and his 6-foot frame arranged in a way that required no additional commentary. Harlan looked at Thomas. He looked at Clara. Something moved across his face that she had never seen there before, not the cold anger, not the calculating patience, but something that looked remarkably like the first distant shadow of fear. You'll regret this, he said. I've already regretted enough things, Clara said. That one I'm willing to take my chances on. Harlan held for another moment. Then he pulled his horse around and rode back the way he came. And Clara watched him go, and her hands were shaking, but she did not look away until he was entirely out of sight. Thomas looked at her. Yes, she said. And this time she was the one who was surprised by how much she meant it. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in Nora's eastern bedroom with the deed on the table beside her and the name Sutton, Hargrove on the scrap of paper, and she went through everything she knew. Every piece of it, building the shape of what had been done to her property, the way you'd build a fence one post at a time. The north pasture gone, the creek rights that fed the south grazing land, the timber acreage, all of it moving, she understood now. In a systematic direction, not random theft, but strategic dismemberment. Garrett wasn't just taking. He was making the land worthless to hold without the pieces he'd acquired. Which meant the end goal was the whole parcel, all 320 acres her father had broken his body to hold. She knew Boyd Garrett by reputation. Everyone in Red Creek knew him by reputation. Which meant they knew him as the man who owned the grain warehouse and the livery and the largest house on the north side of town, who sat on the county land board and gave money to the church and could make problems appear and disappear with the particular ease of a man who had purchased enough influence to make influence itself invisible. She also knew because she had her father's records, and she knew every acre of Whitfield land by heart, that there were things Garrett couldn't simply forge around. The original grant deed, recorded in 1861, was on file with the State Land Office in Austin. The property survey stakes were still in the ground. And the creek rights, her father had argued those rights at the county level in 1879. And the ruling had been recorded, and recorded rulings were considerably harder to make disappear than a man's trust in his own wife. By the time gray light was coming through the window, she had a plan. It was not a complete plan. It had gaps in it that would need to be filled by someone who understood land law better than she did someone like the man on that scrap of paper. She needed to get to Hargrove, and she needed to do it before Harlan figured out that she wasn't coming back, and before Boyd Garrett figured out that the forged deed had been found, and before either of them had time to make her the kind of problem that Red Creek's sheriff would find convenient to resolve in their favor. She was calculating the distance to Hargrove and the state of the roads and how long she could count on Thomas and his brother to keep her presence at Nora's place unannounced when she heard, from somewhere outside, the unmistakable sound of hoofbeats coming slow and deliberate up the lane. She was at the window before she thought about it. It was Caleb Dawson. He stopped his horse at the gate and looked at the house and didn't move. The way a man looks at a place when he's trying to decide whether his arriving is the right call or the wrong one. He looked like he'd slept in his saddle, if he'd slept at all. Clara pulled on her boots and went to the porch. "Mr. Dawson," she said. "Mrs. Whitfield." He looked at her with that same quality of direct attention that had disarmed her the previous afternoon, no performance in it. No social calculation, just the actual looking. "Your husband went into Garrett's place last night at 10 o'clock. He was in there for an hour. He came out with 2 men I didn't recognize and they rode east." Clara's jaw tightened. "How do you know this?" "Because I was camped in the grove south of town and I don't sleep heavy." He adjusted the reins in his hands. "I don't know what it means exactly. But east from here is the direction of your property. And I know what it looks like when a man's trying to move fast to get ahead of something." Clara thought about the records in the house. Her father's original survey maps, her mother's letters, which documented the planting of every fence post and water line on the property. "If Harlan and 2 men were at the ranch, I need to get to Hargrove," she said. Caleb nodded, like this was the answer he'd been expecting. "The road goes through Callaway's jurisdiction for the first 12 miles. I know. I'm riding north today anyway," he said. "My route takes me through Hargrove." She looked at him. You were camped south of town last night, and your route takes you north through Hargrove. One corner of his mouth moved not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. I adjusted my route, he said. Clara studied him for a long moment in the early morning light. In 3 years of marriage, she had learned to read men for threat the way a person learned to read weather always. Automatically, looking for the signs that told you which way the wind was about to shift. Caleb Dawson did not read like threat. He read like something she had less experience with, and therefore found more difficult to calibrate, like a man who was exactly what he appeared to be. Which in her experience was vanishingly rare. I can pay you for your trouble when this is resolved, she said. I'm not looking for payment, he said. I'm not looking for charity, she said. He considered that. Fair enough, he said. Then consider it one traveler helping another along a hard road. No debt involved. She went inside and told Nora. Nora looked at her with an expression that Clara couldn't entirely parse, something between worry and something that wasn't worry. Something older and quieter. Come back when it's done, Nora said. And Clara. She caught her hand at the door. Don't you apologize to a single soul for fighting for what's yours. Not one. Clara squeezed her hand and didn't trust herself to answer. She was on the road north with Caleb Dawson before the sun cleared the tree line. And behind her Red Creek was waking up to a morning that did not yet know what was coming. And the deed was folded against her heart, and her father's land was waiting. And Clara Whitfield was done disappearing. She was just beginning to be found. The first 10 miles out of Red Creek, neither of them said much. That suited Clara fine. She was not a woman who filled silence out of nervousness. And Caleb Dawson appeared to be a man who understood that silence had its uses. They rode at a pace that was steady without being urgent. Urgent would draw attention. And the last thing either of them needed was someone on the road back to town with something to report to Sheriff Calloway before noon. Clara kept the deed inside her coat, against her sternum, where she could feel it with every breath. Her ribs ached from the night before. She breathed carefully and said nothing about it. She was thinking about the match. That was the part she couldn't stop returning to Harlan's, standing over her with her father's deed in one hand and a lit match in the other. Not touching it to the paper, just holding the flame close enough that she could see the edge of the document beginning to brown. He hadn't burned it. She understood now that he hadn't burned it because it wasn't his to burn, it was Garrett's. And Garrett needed it intact for whatever legal machinery he was running. But Harlan hadn't known she understood that. He'd held that match like a man holding the last word in an argument, expecting her to beg. She hadn't begged. She'd waited until he set it down and went to pour himself another drink. And then she'd taken the deed off the table and walked out the back door. And that was the last time she'd been inside the house she'd lived in for 3 years. It occurred to her now, riding north through the dry Texas heat, that she hadn't taken anything else. Not her mother's brooch. Not the photograph of her parents on their wedding day. Not the money she'd been saving in the flour tin for 18 months, $3.40. Collected in coins and small bills from the egg money Harlan didn't bother to track. She'd taken the deed, and she'd walked out in the clothes she was wearing. And she hadn't looked back. She wondered what that meant about who she'd become. You're thinking loud, Caleb said. She glanced at him. He wasn't looking at her. His eyes were on the road ahead. Scanning the way a man scanned when he'd spent enough years in open country to do it automatically. Habit, she said. What kind? The kind where I try to think 3 steps ahead of the person who wants to stop me. He nodded slowly. And how many steps ahead are you right now? 2, she said. Maybe 2.5. What's the half step? She was quiet for a moment. I don't know exactly what Harlan told Garrett last night. I know he told him something, because 2 men rode east toward my property. Which means Garrett knows the deed was taken, but I don't know if he knows it was me who took it. Or if Harlan told him some other story to cover himself. What kind of other story would Harlan tell? That it was stolen, she said. By a drifter, maybe. Or that it was misplaced. Harlan is not a man who admits to his wife outsmarting him. It would cost him too much. She paused. Which means there's a window small but real where Garrett is looking for a thief instead of looking for me specifically. Caleb turned his head and looked at her then. Fully, with that quality of attention that she still hadn't figured out how to be comfortable with. 2.5 steps, he said. Working on the third, she said. Something in his face shifted, not quite a smile, but something that lived in the same neighborhood. He turned back to the road without comment, and Clara found herself thinking that this was a disorient quality in a person. The ability to make you feel seen without making you feel examined. She was not accustomed to it. She was not accustomed to a great many things that had happened in the last 24 hours. And she filed that thought away for later, when she had the luxury of examining it. Right now she had a third step to find. They were 4 miles further north. The land opening up into the broader scrub of the hill country. When Caleb said, without particular inflection, "We've got a rider behind us," Clara did not turn around. Half mile. Moving steady. Not rushing. Following or coincidence. Could be either. Could tell you more if I knew who Garrett would send. He has a man named Dake Pruitt, Clara said. Rides a gray roan. Does Garrett's errands when those errands need to stay quiet. The horse behind us is a bay, then it might not be Pruitt. She thought for a moment. Harlan has a cousin who works for Garrett's warehouse. Younger man rides hard. This one's riding easy, Caleb said. Like he's not trying to catch us, just keeping pace. That was worse, somehow, than if he'd been running them down. A man keeping pace was a man reporting. A man reporting meant someone at the other end of that report making a decision. Can we change the routes? Do it. He didn't argue. Didn't ask if she was sure. He simply turned them west onto a cut trail that dropped down through a dry creek bed and came back north through a stretch of cedar that closed the sight lines behind them. And when they came back out onto the main road, 20 minutes later, the bay horse was nowhere behind them. Clara breathed. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, Caleb said. If he was reporting our position, it doesn't matter that he lost us. He already told someone which direction we were heading. She knew he was right. She nodded and didn't say anything further, because there was nothing further to say about it. You couldn't unring a bell. And what mattered now was moving fast enough to make the information useless. They pushed the pace. It was past midday when they stopped at a creek crossing to water the horses. And the heat was the kind that sat on your shoulders and made thinking feel like work. Clara dismounted and crouched at the water's edge and splashed her face and sat back on her heels and let herself feel the ache in her ribs for a full 30 seconds before she put it away again. She heard Caleb's boots in the dirt behind her, not close. Giving her room. How bad, he asked. She didn't pretend not to understand. Cracked, maybe. Not broken through. I can ride. I didn't ask if you could ride. I asked how bad. She looked at the water moving over the stones. Bad enough that I notice it. Not bad enough that it changes anything. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, has it changed anything before? 3 years of bad enoughs. 3 years of not broken through. She knew exactly what he was asking, and she knew the answer was a long dark corridor. She wasn't prepared to walk down in the middle of a creek crossing, with Harlan's men possibly an hour behind them. No, she said, which was the truest short answer she could give. She heard him exhale, not a sigh, something quieter than that. Something that sounded inconveniently like the sound a person made when they were holding something in, because it wasn't their right to put it down here. She stood up and turned to face him. I need you to understand something. Mr. Dawson, Caleb, he said. I need you to understand, she said. Maintaining her own register, because the correction had flustered her slightly, and she couldn't afford to be flustered. That I am grateful for your help on this road, genuinely. But I am not a project, I am not a woman who needs to be handled. I've had 3 years of someone deciding what I needed. And I am done with that particular arrangement. He looked at her steadily. I'm not trying to handle you, he said. I'm trying to know what I'm working with. so I can be useful and not the other kind." It was such a direct and reasonable thing to say that it momentarily disarmed her. She had prepared, somewhere in the back of her mind, for defensiveness, for the male recoiling that came when a woman drew a line. She had not prepared for simple acknowledgement. "All right," she said after a moment. "All right," he agreed. They watered the horses and got back on the road, and the afternoon stretched out ahead of them toward Hargrove. And Clara began telling him, piece by piece, everything she knew about the land, and what had been done to it because he'd asked the right questions and because, 3 steps ahead or not, she was going to need someone who understood the full shape of the problem before they walked into Sutton's office. She told him about the original 1861 grant, about the creek rights ruling in 1879, about the survey stakes and exactly where they were and what they established. She told him about the 3 payments she'd found recorded in Harlan's coat dates and amounts that corresponded to specific parcels. She told him about the timber acreage and why it mattered, which had to do with a water table that fed not just the Whitfield land, but 2 neighboring properties whose owners didn't yet know they were downstream of a theft. Caleb listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions, both precise, both aimed at exactly the gaps she'd been uncertain about herself. "You know a lot about your family's land," he said when she'd finished. "My father taught me," she said. "He said land was a language and you had to learn to read it, or someone else would read it for you and tell you whatever suited them. Smart man, he was." She paused. "He didn't think to teach me how to keep a man from forging my name on documents. He thought marrying me to a man from a respectful family would be protection enough." The bitterness in that last sentence came out sharper than she intended. She didn't apologize for it. "Did you want to marry him?" Caleb asked. In the beginning, it was an intimate question and he asked it quietly, without pressure, in the tone of someone who would accept silence as a complete answer. "I wanted to want to," she said after a moment. "I'd been told long enough that a man like Harlan choosing a woman like me was something to be grateful for. And I believed it enough to mistake gratitude for wanting." She kept her eyes on the road. "That's a thing that happens to women in small towns. You get told often enough what you're worth and eventually you stop bothering to check the math yourself." "And now?" he asked. "Now I'm checking," she said. They were 2 miles outside Hargrove when the second rider appeared, not behind them this time, but ahead, stopped at a crossroads, with the particular stillness of a man who is waiting for something specific. Caleb's hand moved not to his gun, just shifted his coat back from it. A small deliberate gesture of readiness that Clara registered and filed. The man at the crossroads raised his hand in something that was either a wave or a signal. "You know him?" "No," Clara said. And then, a beat later, as they drew close enough to see the man's face clearly, "Wait." It was Thomas Pearce, Nora's son. He looked like he'd been riding before dawn. His horse lathered and his face tight, with something that had been sitting in his chest all morning. He pulled up alongside them without preamble. "Miss Clara," his voice was rough. "I'm glad I caught you, Thomas. What happened? It wasn't a question." She already knew from his face that something had. "Garrett's men came to the ranch this morning," he said. 6 o'clock. 3 of them. They told my mother she was trespassing on Garrett Land Company property and she had until sundown to vacate. The world went very quiet around Clara. "They told Nora Pearce she was trespassing on her own property," she said. "They had papers," Thomas said. "I don't know what the papers said, but they had a county seal on them and one of the men was wearing a deputy badge. Not one of Calloway's regular men, someone I didn't recognize. A purchased badge," Caleb said. Low and even. Thomas looked at him with the assessment of a man measuring an unknown quantity quickly. Whatever he found seemed to satisfy him, because he turned back to Clara without challenging the presence of a stranger. "My mother wouldn't leave," he said, and something moved across his face that Clara recognized as the specific fear of a grown son who had watched his mother stand unmoved in front of something large and dangerous. She sat down in her kitchen chair, and she told them she had lived on that land for 40 years, and she would leave it horizontal or not at all. Clara closed her eyes for 1 second. 1 precise second of knowing exactly what that looked like. Exactly what Nora's voice had sounded like saying it. The absolute unbending quality of the woman, and the terror underneath the love she felt for her right now. "Where is she?" "Still at the house. My brother is with her." They didn't force her out, not yet, but they said they'd be back at sundown with the sheriff. Thomas's jaw was tight. Calloway this time, not the stranger, which meant Garrett had escalated. Garrett knew the deed was gone, knew it had been Clara who took it. And he was moving on every front, simultaneously reaching her through Nora, because Clara's property was already compromised, and he needed a new pressure point. "He's using her," Clara said, and the coldness in her own voice surprised her. "He can't come after me directly, without showing his hand on the deed. So he's going after Nora's land instead, to make me come back." "To make me trade what?" Thomas asked. "The deed for Nora's safety," she said. "That's what he's betting on, that I'll come back and hand it over to keep her out of it." The silence at that crossroads held for 3 long seconds. Then Caleb said, "Will it work?" Clara looked at him. "What do you think?" "I think," he said carefully, "that if you go back now you lose the deed and Nora still loses her land. Because a man who moves this fast doesn't leave loose ends." "That's what I think too," she said. Thomas looked between them. "Then what do? We go to Hargrove," Clara said. "We find Sutton, we do this right." She looked at Thomas directly. "Your mother knows exactly what she's doing. She sat in that chair because she knew I needed time. We don't waste the time she bought us." Thomas held for a moment the complicated calculation of a son leaving his mother in the path of something dangerous because the woman herself had asked him to. Clara knew that calculation. She'd watched her own father make it once. A long time ago, standing at a crossroads not unlike this one. "She told me to find you," Thomas said finally. She said, "Find Clara, and don't come back until she's fixed it." Clara felt something hot press at the back of her eyes and refused it. Now was not the time. "Then let's go fix it," she said. Elias Sutton's office was above the Hargrove assay office, accessed by an outdoor staircase that complained under the weight of 3 people climbing it at once. The man himself was younger than Clara had expected, mid-40s. Lean, with ink-stained fingers and the distracted intensity of someone whose mind was always operating on 2 tracks simultaneously. He looked up from his desk when they came through the door, and his eyes moved quickly across the 3 of them. "Processing, Mr. Sutton," Clara said before he could speak. "My name is Clara Whitfield. I have a forged deed, a stolen land parcel, a purchased sheriff, and approximately 6 hours before a fraudulent eviction order is executed on my neighbor's property. I need the best 3 hours of your professional life." Sutton looked at her for a moment. "Sit down, Mrs. Whitfield," he said, and reached for a fresh sheet of paper. What followed was the most important conversation Clara had ever had. And also, in its way, the strangest because it required her to lay out every damaged and stolen piece of her family's land on a stranger's desk and watch him handle it with the clinical precision of a surgeon. And to trust that precision without flinching. Sutton was good. She could see why Caleb had named him. He asked questions that went straight to the structural weaknesses of Garrett's scheme, the gaps in the forgery, the recording errors, the procedural violations in the county seal on this morning's eviction papers, which Thomas had brought with him and which Sutton examined with the expression of a man who has found exactly what he was looking for. "This seal," Sutton said, holding the paper up. "Do you see the date stamp?" Clara looked. August 3rd. "The county commissioner who authorizes these orders has been in San Antonio since July 28th. Sutton set the paper down with something close to satisfaction. He could not have signed this order because he was not in the county when it was issued. Which means either his signature is forged or someone used his seal without his authorization. Either way, it's invalid, Clara said. Procedurally void, Sutton said. Which doesn't stop Garrett's men from showing up at sundown. but it gives us grounds to challenge any action taken under it. And it puts a very different light on the county's involvement in this matter. He looked at her. Mrs. Whitfield, how long has this been going on? The transfers I found records for go back 2 years, she said. But I believe Garrett and my husband made their arrangement before the marriage. I think she said it carefully, because she had only worked this part out on the road, and it still had the uncertain quality of a thing, not fully confirmed. I think Harlan married me as part of the scheme. My father was ill. The land needed a man's name on it to do certain legal transactions under county law. Harlan provided the name. The room was very quiet. Thomas made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Caleb, who had been sitting to her left, and had said almost nothing since they sat down, said nothing now either, but she felt the quality of his silence change, become denser. The way air changed before weather. Sutton looked at her with an expression that had moved from professional into something more human. Do you have evidence for that? Not yet, she said. But the timing of the marriage and the first transfer coincide. And if Garrett's books show a payment to Harlan that predates the wedding, that would establish a conspiracy, Sutton said. And it would change the nature of the fraud substantially. We'd be looking at a criminal matter, not just a civil one. He folded his hands on the desk. Mrs. Whitfield, I need to be honest with you about something. Please. What I can do today is file an emergency injunction to halt the eviction of the Pearce property based on the procedural void in that order. I can do that before sundown. I can also begin the process of challenging the deed transfers on your land. And if the forgery is as clear as this document suggests, we have a strong case. He paused. What I cannot do quickly is the larger case. Building the evidence for a conspiracy between your husband and Garrett that takes time. Weeks, possibly months, and during that time Garrett will know someone is coming at him. And he will not sit still. I know, Clara said. He has significant influence in this county. I know that too, and your husband Sutton chose his words. Your husband will likely attempt to exercise his legal rights as your spouse to control me and the property, Clara said flatly. Yes, I understand the law on that. I've been thinking about it. Sutton looked at her with the particular respect of a man recalibrating his expectations. Then you understand that your personal safety is part of the legal equation here, and not a separate matter. I understand it now, she said. I didn't always. There was something in the room after that, a weight, a texture, the specific gravity of something true being said in front of witnesses. Thomas was looking at the floor. Caleb was looking at his hands. Sutton was looking at her, and she met his eyes and didn't look away, because she was done with looking away from things. File the injunction, she said, and tell me what you need from me for the rest of it. They were back on the stairs when the sound reached them from the street below, raised voices. And underneath the voices, the particular sound of horses being ridden with urgency. Caleb was at the railing first. Clara was half a step behind him. 4 riders coming down Hargrove's Main Street, moving fast. She didn't recognize 3 of them, but the fourth was riding a gray roan. And his name was Deke Pruitt, and he worked for Boyd Garrett. They tracked us, Thomas said, his voice gone flat. They tracked the direction, Caleb said, which is different. They're not coming up these stairs because they don't know which office we're in. Not yet, Clara said. No, he agreed, not yet. Pruitt and his men had pulled up outside the assay office below them. They hadn't looked up. They were consulting with each other. The low, urgent conference of men who have found the neighborhood, but not the address. Clara looked at the street. She looked at the riders. She looked at the deed inside her coat and thought about everything that paper represented, 320 acres. Her mother's fruit trees, her father's broken back and calloused hands, an absolute certain belief that what you built with honest work was yours, and no man's swindle could permanently take it from you. Then she thought about Nora Pearce, sitting in her kitchen chair, telling Garrett's men she'd leave horizontal or not at all. She thought about Harlan's hand and the sound the match had made. She thought about every year she'd spent counting, She turned to Caleb. His eyes were already on her. "If I walk down these stairs right now," she said quietly, "Pruitt sees me, and this ends here in the street." "On Garrett's," Caleb said. "And if I stay up here—" "Sutton files the injunction, and we have until morning before Garrett can legally move again." "That's the theory," Caleb said carefully. "What's the practice?" He held for a moment. "The practice is that Pruitt has 4 men, and I have my gun, and Thomas has his. And that's a conversation I'd rather not have on a public staircase in a town where I don't know who's friendly. So we need another way down," Clara said. "I know another way down," Sutton said from the doorway behind them they'd both forgotten. For a moment that he was there. He was holding his coat and his hat, and he looked, for the first time, like a man who was choosing a side consciously and did not intend to unchoose it. "There's a back staircase that comes out behind the feed store. It connects to the alley on Corver Street." He paused. "I also have a friend at the telegraph office 2 blocks from here." Clara looked at him. "Why does the telegraph office matter?" "Because the state land office in Austin has a direct wire," Sutton said. "And I've been wanting to send Boyd Garrett a particular kind of message for 2 years. He put on his hat. "If you'll permit me, Mrs. Whitfield, I'd like to send it tonight. Under your name." The sound of Pruitt's voice reached them from below, asking questions. The tone of a man narrowing his search. Clara looked at Caleb. He gave her the smallest nod she'd ever seen. She looked at Sutton. "Let's go," she said, and they went down the back stairs into the alley in the early evening air. And behind them, Deke Pruitt was still looking in the wrong direction. And ahead of them, the telegraph office was 2 blocks away, and Austin was 300 miles south. And Clara Whitfield had stopped counting bruises and started counting something else entirely. Evidence. Steps. The precise and patient arithmetic of a woman who had decided, once and for all, that the math was going to come out differently this time. The telegraph office smelled like hot metal and nervous energy. And the man behind the counter looked up when the 4 of them came through the back entrance with the specific expression of someone who had been expecting something unusual and had not quite expected it to be this unusual. "Elias," he said, looking at Sutton. "Hank," Sutton said. "I need the Austin wire. State Land Office, attention Commissioner Reed. And I need it in the next 10 minutes. Hank looked at Clara. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Thomas, who was still carrying the fury of a man who had left his mother surrounded by Garrett's hired hands and had not yet had anywhere to put it. "Is this about what I think it's about?" Hank asked. "It's about Boyd Garrett," Sutton said. Hank turned to his equipment without another word. Clara had spent 3 years learning that most people in Red Creek had made their calculations about Boyd Garrett a long time ago and had decided the safest position was looking sideways. What she hadn't understood until this moment was that sideways was not the same as approving. Some people were waiting. They just needed to see someone step into the street first. Sutton drafted the wire in 4 minutes flat, a formal notification to the State Land Office, flagging the Whitfield property transfers for immediate review, citing the procedural void in the county commissioner's seal and attaching, in summary form, the evidence of forgery in the deed. He read it back to Clara before sending it, and she changed 2 words and left the rest. Because the 2 words she changed made the document sound less like a lawyer's filing and more like a woman stating facts. And she had a feeling that Commissioner Reed in Austin would respond differently to a woman stating facts than to another attorney's brief. "Send it," she said. Hank sent it. The machine chattered and clicked and went quiet. And for a moment the 4 of them stood in that small room and listened to the silence that followed. The particular silence of something that cannot be unsent. "How long for a response?" Caleb asked. "Tonight if Reed is in his office," Hank said. "Morning at the latest if he's gone home." He paused. "Reed doesn't like Garrett. Hasn't since the water rights business in '84. I can't guarantee what he'll do, but I can tell you he'll read it." "That's enough," Clara said. It wasn't enough. She knew it wasn't enough. The injunction Sutton had filed would halt the Pearce eviction tonight if it reached Callaway before sundown, which required a rider leaving Hargrove in the next 30 minutes, which Sutton had already arranged before they'd come downstairs. But the injunction was one finger in one hole in a dam that Garrett had been building for 2 years. And the dam had many holes and Clara only had so many fingers. What she needed was a flood. She was working out what that meant in practical terms when the telegraph machine stuttered back to life. Everyone in the room went still. Hank bent over the readout, translating the clicks with his fingers moving slightly, the way telegraph men did when they were reading fast. His face went through 3 different expressions in quick succession: surprise, then something sharper, then a careful blankness that told Clara the message was something he was deciding how to present. "Read it," she said. "It's not from Reed," he said. "It's from the Austin field office, a land agent named Carver. He looked at the paper in his hand. He says, and I'm reading exactly: Whitfield property flagged in our office since March. Active inquiry suppressed at county level. Await your documentation. Do not use county channels. Send direct the room absorb that." Then Thomas said, "Suppressed. Someone in the county office killed an existing investigation. That's what it means," Sutton said. And his voice had the quality of a man who has just had a long suspicion confirmed. "Garrett has someone inside the county land board. I've thought so for 2 years, now we know." Clara looked at the message in Hank's hand. She thought about the word suppressed. She thought about an investigation, that someone had started, someone in Austin who had seen the same patterns she'd found in Harlan's coat pocket, and that someone in the county had quietly buried. She thought about how long that might have been sitting there, waiting, if she hadn't walked into a telegraph office on the right night. She thought about all the other women, all the other families. The 3 ranches Caleb had mentioned that Garrett's operation had already taken. The people who'd lost them without a Sutton in reach, or a wire to Austin, or a stubborn neighbor who sat in her kitchen chair and refused to move. "How do we send documentation directly?" she asked. "I can have copies of the deed and the transfer records on a stage to Austin by 7 tomorrow morning," Sutton said. "Physical copies, witnessed and notarized tonight." "Do it," Clara said. "Tonight. All of it. There's a notary 2 streets over who owes me a significant professional favor," Sutton said. And for the first time, he allowed himself something that was close to grimness. "I intend to collect it." They were back on the street, moving. Always moving, because standing still felt like offering a target when Caleb fell into step beside her and said quietly. Pruitt's men split up. 2 went toward the hotel. 2 are near the livery. "They're looking for the horses," Clara said. "And for a place we'd sleep," he said. "Which means we don't sleep in Hargrove." She had already been thinking this. "Sutton has documents. The wire is sent. There's nothing more we can do tonight that requires us to be in this town, so we ride." "We ride," she agreed. Thomas, walking behind them, said, "Where?" Clara had been carrying the answer to that question in the back of her mind since the crossroads. Since Thomas had appeared with his horse lathered and his face tight. Since she'd done the arithmetic of what Garrett was doing and understood the full shape of it. There was only one place to go that made any sense. Only one position that put her on ground she knew better than Garrett's men did. Only one move that changed the terms of this from running to standing. "Home," she said. Thomas's stride broke for a half. Caleb didn't break stride at all, but she felt him register it. "Your ranch," she said. "My ranch," she said, "my father's land. My name on the original grant, if Garrett wants it. He can come and look me in the eye while he tries to take it. And I will be standing in my own doorway when he does." "Clara," Thomas said. Carefully, "Harlan is there. I know. And possibly Garrett's men. I know that too. And Calloway," she said, "is going to have a very interesting morning when he finds out that the county commissioner's seal on this evening's eviction order was fraudulent and that the state land office in Austin has flagged this property for active review." She paused. "Calloway is a man who survives by reading which direction the wind is blowing. By morning, the wind is going to be blowing from Austin. And I want to be on my own land when he figures that out." Caleb said nothing. But she could feel the quality of his silence, and it was the silence of a man who was running the same calculations she was and coming out in the same place. "It's a risk," he said finally. "Everything since yesterday morning has been a risk," she said. "At least this one is mine to take." They rode through the early dark with the stars coming out hard and bright over the Texas hill country. The kind of sky that made distances feel both enormous and intimate. And Clara rode with the ache in her ribs and the deed against her chest and her mind, doing what it had been doing for 24 hours, building, dismantling, rebuilding the shape of what was possible. It was Thomas who said it first, an hour into the ride. His voice coming out of the dark behind them with the abruptness of something that had been working its way out for a while. "My mother lost her first husband on that land," he said. "Before my father, before me and Danny were born. She buried him there and she stayed. Because she said, you didn't leave the place where you'd put someone you loved." That was 40 years ago, a pause. "She is not going to leave that land for Boyd Garrett. She would actually rather die." "She's not going to die," Clara said. With a certainty she was choosing, rather than feeling. "No," Thomas said, "she's not. Because we're going to fix it." He said it the way his mother would have said it, flat and final. Not a prayer, but a statement of intent. Clara heard it and felt something steady up in her chest. Something that was not quite hope and not quite courage, but was something made of both of them. The composite feeling of people who have decided together. They rode in silence for a while after that. Then Caleb said, "Not to anyone in particular. I need to tell you both something." His voice had a different quality, and Clara registered it immediately, the slight weight of someone who has been carrying information and has arrived at the point where carrying it alone stops being reasonable. "Garrett's operation," he said. "The 3 ranches I mentioned. I know them because 2 years ago I was working a drive up through this county, and I stopped overnight at a place called the Dunmore Spread. Good family, 3 generations on the land." He paused. 3 weeks after I left, Garrett's land company filed a claim on their water rights. 6 months after that, the Dunmores were gone. I heard later they'd gone to Kansas. Started over. Another pause. I've been watching Garrett since then. From a distance when my work brought me through. Watching his pattern. Clara turned her head. She could just make out his face in the starlight, that same quality of steadiness. But with something underneath it now, something older and less settled. "You came to Red Creek on purpose," she said. "It wasn't an accusation. It was an accounting." "I came through Red Creek," he said. "I come through regular. I've been watching the county records when I'm in Hargrove. I knew about the Whitfield transfers. I didn't know." He stopped. "I didn't know about you specifically, about what was happening inside that house." The last sentence landed with the specific weight of a thing that cannot be made lighter by how carefully it is set down. Clara was quiet for a moment. The road moved under the horses. The dark held them. "If you'd known," she said, "what would you have done?" He was quiet for long enough that it became its own kind of answer. "I don't know," he said finally. "That's the honest answer. A man's wife is his legal concern, and a stranger walking onto a ranch to say something about it. He left that unfinished. I'd like to think I would have found a way. I don't know if that's true." She appreciated the honesty more, then she would have appreciated the better answer. "Well," she said, "you found a way now." "You found the way," he said. "I'm just riding the same direction." They smelled the smoke before they saw the light. Clara's horse felt it in her before she consciously registered it, the animal's head coming up. Ears forward, the slight lateral shift that horses made when something in the air didn't fit. And then Clara smelled it too, that particular texture of wood smoke that was too heavy for a cooking fire. Too present for a banked hearth, the smell of something burning that shouldn't be burning. Her stomach went cold. "That's from the south," Caleb said. And his voice was completely flat in a way that was worse than alarm. "My land is south," Clara said. She kicked her horse into a run before the sentence was finished. The night turned into speed and wind and the thunder of hooves on the hard road, and Clara rode with everything she had. Leaning forward, her ribs screaming and her hands steady on the reins. Because it didn't matter. The ribs didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the smell of smoke, getting heavier with every quarter mile. She came over the rise and saw it, the barn. Not the house, the barn. Fully involved, the fire eating through the old dry timber, with the speed that old dry timber always went, the light of it throwing everything into harsh moving relief. She could see figures moving at the edges, 2 men. Backlit, not fighting the fire, just watching it, waiting. She pulled up hard, her horse skidding on the road. And Caleb was beside her a second later, and Thomas a second after that. "They're not trying to put it out," Thomas said, his voice stripped of everything. "They're not there to put it out," Caleb said. Clara looked at the 2 figures watching her barn burn. She looked at the house, which was dark, which meant Harlan was either inside or wasn't there. She looked at the fire and thought about what was in that barn, her father's tools. The draft mare and her foal, 18 months of hay, that represented the difference between a working ranch and a piece of land with nothing on it. She thought about something else too. "The survey stakes," she said. Caleb turned sharply. "What?" "The original survey stakes for the south property line are marked on 2 posts inside that barn," she said. "My father stored them there when he rebuilt the fence in '79. They're the physical evidence that establishes the property boundary that Garrett's Creek rights claim disputes." She looked at the fire. "If those posts burn, we lose the clearest physical proof of the original survey." 1 breath of silence. "How deep are the posts set?" Caleb asked. "Near the east wall," she said. "Corner storage. They might not have caught yet." "Might," he said. "I know what might means," she said. She was moving before he could say anything further, not riding. Dismounting, because you couldn't take a horse into the edge of a barn fire. But moving toward it on foot with the absolute focused intention of a woman who has done the math and knows exactly what she's risking and has decided the risk is worth it. Caleb was beside her in 3 strides. She didn't tell him to stay back. She had a feeling it would have been a waste of breath. And she was conserving breath for other things. "East wall," she said. "I heard you," he said. The heat was immense, of physical pressure. A wall of it, the roar of the fire louder up close than it had looked from the road. The 2 figures who'd been watching scattered when they realized someone was coming, which told Clara everything she needed to know about what they'd been paid to do and what they hadn't been paid to do. Garrett's hired men were watchers and intimidators, not fighters, not when facing someone who was moving toward the fire instead of away from it. The east wall of the barn was still standing. The fire had taken the roof and the west side and was working its way across the beams, and the heat in the east corner was survivable for about 2 minutes. Possibly went in first. Clara was half a step behind. The smoke was thick and low, and she dropped her chin and breathed through her teeth and moved along the east wall by memory more than sight. Because she had been in this barn 10,000 times, and she knew exactly where her father had stacked the old fence posts in the corner. Knew the specific feel of the rough-hewn wood under her hands. Her hands found them. 2 posts 6 feet long, with the survey markers still nailed to the upper third. Heavy. She took one end of the first one and pulled, and it shifted. And then Caleb was at the other end, and they moved it together fast. Not careful, because careful was no longer an option out through the east wall opening and into the air. She went back for the second one. Caleb grabbed her arm, not stopping her, pointing. The beam above the east corner had a crack running through it that hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. She went in anyway. The second post was heavier than the first. She got her hands under it and pulled, and it moved, and the beam cracked again overhead. And she thought with complete clarity, if that comes down right now, this is how it ends. And she also thought with equal clarity, it hasn't come down yet. She dragged the post out through the opening, and the beam came down 4 seconds after she cleared the wall. a crash that sent a wave of heat and sparks over her back as she stumbled forward into the open air. And Caleb caught her arm and kept her upright, and they stood there in the orange dark, with 2 fence posts and the sound of her barn dying behind them. Thomas was beside them a moment later, his face unreadable in the firelight. "You could have been killed," he said. "The posts are intact," Clara said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, too steady. Like something running on reserves she hadn't known she had. "Clara," Caleb said, and something in the way he said her name made her stop. He wasn't looking at the barn. He was looking at the house. The front door was open, and standing in the doorway, with the firelight making his face into something terrible, was Harlan Whitfield. He looked at the posts in her hands. He looked at Caleb. He looked at her, and his face went through something she had never seen on it before, not anger. Not calculation, but a kind of naked, unguarded thing that she would have called panic if she'd thought Harlan was capable of it. "You went in there," he said. His voice was strange. "You went into a burning barn. To save the survey stakes," she said. "That you and Garrett burned the barn to destroy." "Clara." "I didn't." "Don't," she said. The single word landed with the weight of 3 years behind it. Harlan took a step forward off the porch. Caleb moved, not aggressively, not drawing, just stepping to a position that was between Harlan and Clara in a way that was neither subtle nor apologetic. Harlan stopped. He looked at Caleb with the specific expression of a man recalibrating a situation that has not gone as he expected. "Who the hell are you?" he said. "A man standing here," Caleb said simply. "This is my property," Harlan said. "This is my wife. And I'm telling you, the property is under state review as of tonight," Clara said, stepping out from behind Caleb's shoulder, because she was not a woman who stood behind anyone anymore. She had decided that. She had decided on the stairs of Sutton's building, and she was not unreading it now. "And I have documentation of every fraudulent transfer you signed with Boyd Garrett's land company going back 2 years. The state land office has a copy. An attorney in Hargrove has a copy." And in approximately, she glanced at the sky, at the position of the stars, 8 hours. "The county commissioner is going to have an extremely uncomfortable conversation about a seal that was used on an eviction order he never authorized." Harlan stared at her. She had spent 3 years being careful not to let him see how much she understood. She had hidden it the way she hid everything, quietly, systematically, in the spaces he didn't think to look. Standing in the firelight of the barn he'd had burned. She let him see it now, all of it. His face changed. "You have no idea what you've done," he said, and his voice was low and ugly. "Garrett has men in this county that you cannot." "I walked into a burning barn tonight," she said. "And I walked back out." She held the survey post in both hands, and her arms were shaking from the weight and the adrenaline and the ribs that had not stopped hurting. And she didn't put it down. "I'm not afraid of Boyd Garrett's men. And I am not afraid of you. I should have said that 3 years ago, and I didn't. And that is the last thing I have to apologize for." Something passed across Harlan's face, something complex and ugly, and underneath both of those, something that was almost pitiably small. He looked, for just a moment, like what he was, a man who had built his entire sense of himself on the diminishment of someone who had just declined to be diminished. Then his expression closed, and the calculation came back. And he said, "You can't stay here tonight. The barn is gone, and the house is mine. The house is on land under state review." Sutton had told her precisely this, and no asset on a property under active state inquiry may be exclusively occupied or claimed by a party under investigation without court order. She said exactly that. She saw Harlan realize she had it by heart. "Go inside, Harlan," she said, "or go to Garrett's. But you're not running me off this land tonight. Not tonight or any night after this." He held for a long moment that felt much longer. Then he turned and went inside, and the door closed behind him, and the sound of the latch was the loudest thing she'd heard all day. Thomas put his hand on her shoulder. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She finally set the survey post down. Her hands were shaking badly now that she'd let go of it. She pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed through the shaking and waited for it to pass. The way you waited out any storm, not fighting it. Not fleeing it, just holding your position until it moved through. Caleb was at her left side. He didn't touch her. He just stood there, present and solid, the way you stood next to someone in a hard wind, not holding them up. Just making the wind a little less. You need to sit down, he said quietly. Not yet, she said. Clara, 5 more minutes, she said. I need 5 more minutes to be sure he's not coming back out. He didn't argue. He stood there for 5 minutes, and she stood beside him. And the barn burned itself down to something that was no longer dangerous. Just sad and smoking and finished, and the survey posts were on the ground beside her feet. Their evidence intact. When the 5 minutes were up, Thomas said, Danny should be at Nora's by now, I should ride. Go, Clara said. Tell her she stopped. Tell her I know what she did. Sitting in that chair. Tell her I know. Thomas nodded. He mounted and rode, and the sound of his horse faded into the dark. And Clara and Caleb were left in the orange fading light of what used to be her barn. The response from Austin, Caleb said after a while. Sutton will have it by morning. I know. And if Carver's office is involved, it changes the scope. This isn't just county anymore, I know that too. So what you did tonight, the stakes, the documentation, the wire he stopped, it was enough. You did enough. She looked at the smoking ruin that had been her father's barn. She thought about the tool her father had built with his own hands, hanging on that wall. She thought about the draft mare, who Thomas had thankfully moved to Nora's property 2 days ago without knowing yet why that would matter. She thought about a woman who had spent 3 years counting blows in the dark and had stopped one night and started counting something else instead. Almost enough, she had all the way. No, Caleb agreed. Not yet, she looked at him. The firelight was nearly gone now. Just the deep red glow of coals, and in it his face was quiet and serious and present in the specific way that some people were present, not performing it. Just inhabiting it. Why are you still here, she asked. It came out genuine rather than challenging. She actually wanted to know. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the coals. Because you walked into that barn, he said finally. And you came back out, carrying what mattered, and I have not in a long time seen someone do something like that. A pause. And because the job isn't done. It might take weeks, she said. Months, Sutton said. You have a cattle drive. The drive can wait, he said. And his voice was simple in the way that simple things sometimes were, not uncomplicated. But honest. Just honest. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about all the things she'd learned to mistrust. All the careful calibrations of 3 years, the specific education in disappointment that had rewritten her understanding of what was possible. She thought about standing at Nora's gate telling Harlan no. She thought about the telegraph machine chattering in the dark. She thought about going into a burning barn and coming back out. All right, she said at last. Then stay. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise. It was 2 words offered by a woman who was still learning what it felt like to ask for something without apologizing for the asking. He nodded once, and he stayed. The coals glowed low in the dark, and somewhere to the east, 300 miles away in Austin, a man named Carver was reading a wire that had been sent in the name of Clara Whitfield. And somewhere in a county records office, a clerk was going to find in the morning that an investigation had been unsuppressed. And somewhere in a house 20 feet away, a man was doing the math on a situation that had stopped adding up the way he needed it to. And Clara sat down on the fence rail that still stood at the edge of what had been her barn. And she breathed, and she hurt, and she waited for the dawn that was going to change everything, not because someone was going to save her, but because she had already done most of the saving herself. The rest was just morning. Dawn came in slow and gray, the way it did after a night that had burned through everything soft and left only the hard structure underneath. Clara had not slept. She had sat on that fence rail through the small hours with the survey posts at her feet and the deed against her chest, and her mind running the same loop it had been running since she'd walked out of her house 2 mornings ago, forward, backward, checking the joints, testing the weight, looking for the place where the whole structure might give. She was not a woman who could rest while there were still gaps. Her father had been the same way. Her mother used to say he'd lie awake solving problems that wouldn't exist until Tuesday. And he'd say back that Tuesday had a way of arriving whether you were ready or not. Tuesday had arrived. Caleb had taken the first watch without being asked and the second without being told. And somewhere around 3 a.m, Clara had realized he hadn't slept either and had said so. And he'd said, "I'll sleep when this is done." And she hadn't argued because she understood that particular variety of wakeful the way she understood her own. The light was barely gray when hoofbeats came up the main track. Both of them were on their feet before the rider cleared the cottonwoods. Clara's hand went to the fence post, not a weapon. Just something solid to hold. Caleb shifted his coat back from his gun with that same small deliberate gesture she'd catalogued on the road to Hargrove. It was Sutton. He was riding hard for a man his age, and he pulled up with the reins gathered tight and his face carrying something that was either very good news or the specific expression of someone who had found something they hadn't been looking for and wasn't yet sure what it meant. There was a response from Carver's office, he said, before his horse had fully stopped. Not just a response. He wired the state attorney general's office last night. Independent of our filing, he looked at Clara directly. The Whitfield property has been on the state's watch list since March. Someone filed a complaint with Austin 7 months ago. Clara stared at him. Who filed it? Sutton reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. A woman named Margaret Dunmore. The name hit the air and Caleb went absolutely still. The Dunmore spread, Clara said, looking at him. Margaret Dunmore, Caleb said, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before, something tightly controlled. Something personal. She was the grandmother. 3 generations on that land. I told you. When they lost it, I didn't know she'd filed anything. He looked at Sutton. She's 70 years old, and she walked into the state land office and filed a complaint, and someone in the county board buried it, Sutton said. But not before the state office had made their own copy. He looked between them. The Attorney General's office has had an open inquiry for 7 months. They were waiting for county-level documentation that would never come. Because the county was compromised. What we sent last night, he held up the paper. This isn't just our case anymore. We gave them the piece they were missing. Clara absorbed this. She absorbed the whole shape of it, the old woman in Austin. The buried complaint, the 7 months of waiting. The single wire that had connected 2 halves of something that had been broken apart on purpose. Garrett knew, she said. He knew there was a state inquiry. That's why he's been moving so fast. He's been trying to complete the transfers before the state could build enough to act. That is exactly what I believe, Sutton said. And it means that what he did last night, he glanced at the smoking ruin of the barn. His expression tightened. Burning your barn was not the act of a man who is confident. It was the act of a man who is afraid men. Clara knew from 3 years of careful study, were not safer than confident men. They were faster and less careful, and they didn't think as far ahead. What does the Attorney General's office do next, she asked. Their investigator is already in the county, Sutton said. Has been for 2 weeks. He was waiting for cause to move openly. Our filing last night gave him the cause. He paused. His name is Webb. He'll be in Red Creek by 8 this morning. Clara looked at the sky. The gray was warming toward the pale gold that preceded actual dawn. Maybe an hour. And Garrett, she said, doesn't know any of this yet, Sutton said. As of last night, he thought he was pressuring a woman into handing back a deed. He doesn't know about Carver. He doesn't know about Webb. He doesn't know that Margaret Dunmore walked into an Austin office 7 months ago and started something he couldn't bury fast enough. Sutton almost smiled. He's going to have a very educational morning. Harlan came out of the house at 6. Clara heard the door and turned and watched him walk toward her across the yard with the specific body language of a man who has spent the night reconsidering his position and has not found a comfortable one. He looked like he hadn't slept. He looked in the particular unguarded quality of early morning, like someone she had almost forgotten existed underneath the man she'd been afraid of, someone younger. Someone who had been making bad calculations for so long he'd forgotten they were calculations. She did not soften toward that person, but she looked at him clearly. Which was different. "Clara," he said. He stopped 6 feet from her. He didn't look at Caleb or Sutton. He looked at her. "I need to talk to you." "Alone?" "No," she said. His jaw tightened. The old reflexive anger moved across his face, and then, visibly, he pushed it down. That alone told her more about how much had shifted than anything he could have said. "What I did," he started, then stopped, then started again. "What Garrett and I, what I let him." He stopped a third time. And Clara watched him struggle with the syntax of a man who has done a wrong thing and is trying to describe it in a way that reduces his own involvement. And she waited without helping him, because she was done helping Harlan Whitfield manage the distance between himself and his own actions. "You married me to get access to this land," she said. "That's what happened." "Say it." The silence lasted 4 seconds. "It started that way," he said, and his voice was low and something in it was genuinely wretched. "Garrett approached my father 2 years before we married. He knew your father was sick. He knew the land would need managing. He offered." He stopped. "It started that way. But then I don't," Clara said. "Whatever you're about to say about what changed, don't say it to me. Say it to the Attorney General's investigator who's going to be in Red Creek in an hour." Harlan went the color of old ash. "The state," he started, "has an open inquiry," she said. "Has had one since March. Your arrangement with Garrett has been visible from Austin for 7 months. Harlan, the only reason you're not already arrested is that the county board buried the complaint. And that ends this morning." He looked at her. He looked at the smoking barn behind her. He looked at Sutton, who met his gaze with the polite blankness of an attorney who has heard everything and is surprised by nothing. And at Caleb, who looked at him with an expression that Clara would have described as simply being there, no threat in it. No performance, just the absolute immovable quality of a man who had decided where he was standing. "You need to get ahead of this," Sutton said, addressing Harlan with professional evenness. "A man who comes forward voluntarily with what he knows about Garrett's operation is in a materially different position than a man who waits to be found. I am not your attorney, and I am not advising you. I'm telling you a fact." Harlan stood in the early morning light, and Clara watched him stew his calculations, the same calculations she'd watched him stew for 3 years. But for the first time, the numbers weren't running in his favor, and he knew it. She could see the exact moment he knew it. His face didn't collapse. It just settled into something resigned and diminished, and underneath all of it, young in the way that people were young when everything they'd built their life on turned out to be borrowed. He looked at Clara one more time. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked back at him. She held the look for a long moment and went through everything she might say and found, at the bottom of all of it, that she had nothing to offer him. Not forgiveness, that wasn't something she owed him, and she wasn't going to perform it. Not rage either, because rage required her to keep him at the center of something she was ready to move him out of. Just nothing. Just the flat, clear air of someone who had finished with a thing. "Go talk to Webb," she said. "That's the only useful thing you can do now." He went. She watched him go and felt Thomas arrive at her shoulder. He must have ridden back from Nora's in the early hours. Because he was there now, solid and present, and he said nothing. Just stood beside her, and that was exactly right. Webb arrived at 7:45. He was not what Clara had expected, which had been someone formal and distant. The particular variety of official that made you feel like a file number rather than a person. Webb was 50, compact, with a permanent squint that suggested he spent most of his time outdoors reading things that were far away. He shook Clara's hand first before he shook Sutton's, and he looked at the burned barn and then looked at her ribs. She was holding herself differently than she had yesterday. The night catching up with the damage, and he said, "Do you need a doctor before we start?" "After," she said. "Then let's start," he said. What followed was 3 hours that Clara would remember for the rest of her life, not as dramatic, because drama, she was learning, was mostly in the anticipation and the aftermath. And the middle was usually work, but as exact. Webb asked precise questions, and she gave precise answers, and Sutton produced documents, and Caleb, who had met Webb once before in a professional context that he explained briefly, and that Webb accepted with a nod of recognition, provided the corroborating account of Garrett's pattern across the county. The survey posts from the barn sat beside the table. Webb examined the markers on them for 4 minutes without speaking, then said, "These establish the boundary that Garrett's creek rights claim requires to be elsewhere." He set them down. With the recording in the county file and these physical markers, the creek rights transfer is not just fraudulent, it's structurally impossible. The land described in the transfer does not exist as Garrett filed it. He filed it knowing that, Clara said. He did, he made a note. "Mrs. Whitfield, I need to ask you something directly, and I need a direct answer." "All right. Your husband came to my office an hour ago." The room shifted. Clara kept her face still. "He provided a signed statement," Webb continued, detailing the arrangement with Garrett from inception. The original offer from Garrett's representative, the terms of the agreement, the payments received, and the specific dates and amounts of every transfer. He looked at her steadily. "It is a comprehensive statement, more comprehensive than I expected." "What does that mean for the case?" Clara asked. "It means that Boyd Garrett's operation is fully documented from both directions," Webb said. "External evidence and internal corroboration. It means this doesn't end with your property. It means every land transaction Garrett's company has executed in this county for the past 5 years is now subject to review." He paused. "It means the Dunmore family may get their land back." The silence in the room was the particular silence of something large landing softly. Caleb made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Clara looked at him, and he was looking at the table, and his jaw was working slightly. The controlled movement of a man managing something he hadn't expected to feel this quickly in this direction. "The Dunmore is still in Austin," Webb said. "She checks with our office every 2 weeks. Has since March." He allowed himself something that was close to warmth. "She's a persistent woman." "She is," Caleb said quietly. Clara reached across without thinking and put her hand briefly over his 1 second. A press and release, gone before it could be anything more than what it was. Which was one person acknowledging another person's feeling because the feeling was real and deserved acknowledging. He looked at her, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything. And that was enough. The sound of horses coming into the yard arrived at 11. And it was not one horse or two, but several, and the quality of the sound organized. Deliberate official brought everyone to their feet. Sutton looked out, then turned back with an expression that combined professional satisfaction with something older and more human. "That," he said, "is Sheriff Calloway. And next to him is a man I don't recognize but whose badge I can read from here." He straightened his coat. "And behind them both are Boyd Garrett and 2 of his attorneys." Clara stood up. Something moved through her that she couldn't immediately name, not fear. She'd burned through fear somewhere around the time she'd walked into a burning barn. And not triumph either, because whatever was happening outside hadn't finished happening yet. It was something in between, something that felt like the moment before a storm broke. The pressure of everything that was about to change, pressing against the last seconds before it changed. "Stay inside?" Caleb asked, low and neutral, giving her the option. "No," she said. She walked out first. Boyd Garrett was not what Red Creek's reputation had led her to expect. She had built him in her mind from 3 years of his influence felt at a remove through Harlan's behavior, through the town's careful deference, through the specific way Calloway's voice changed when Garrett's name came up. She had expected someone large, someone physically imposing, someone who looked like the weight he carried. Garrett was of medium height, perhaps 60, with the well-maintained appearance of a man who spent money on being looked at. His clothes were correct in a way that suggested effort rather than ease. He had the kind of face that would have been handsome at 35 and had since organized itself into something that looked like authority if you accepted its own assessment of itself. He looked at Clara, and she watched him do the same thing the town of Red Creek had been doing her entire life: the flicker. The reassessment, the unconscious decision about the weight of what she might say. She was so tired of that particular sequence, Mrs. Whitfield, he said, and his voice was the voice of a man who was still, even now, running the version of this where he controlled the terms. I think there may have been some misunderstanding about the nature of the agreements your husband entered into, and I'd like the opportunity to clarify, Mr. Garrett, Webb said. Stepping out beside Clara, he produced his identification with the economy of a man who had done it many times and found the effect reliable. I'm Investigator James Webb, Attorney General's office. I've been expecting to speak with you. Garrett looked at the identification. A very specific sequence of expressions moved across his face recognition. Reassessment, the rapid internal calculation of a man who has just understood that the situation is not what he arrived expecting. His attorneys closed in on either side of him, with the instinctive movement of men trained to do exactly that when a client's face made that particular sequence. I wasn't aware the Attorney General's office had any interest in, one of the attorneys started. We've had interest since March, Webb said pleasantly. We've been building the evidentiary foundation. We now have it. He looked at Garrett. Your former business partner, Mr. Whitfield, provided a signed statement this morning. The State Land Office has confirmed the fraudulent nature of 6 property transfers in this county over the past 4 years. And I have physical evidence establishing that the creek rights claim against the Whitfield property is structurally impossible under the original survey. He paused. We can do this here, or we can do it in my office. Those are the options. Calloway, who had been sitting on his horse through all of this, with the expression of a man who has realized very instantly that he backed the wrong side of a fence, and is now looking for a way to appear to have been on the right side all along, cleared his throat. Mr. Garrett, Calloway said, I think you'd best. Garrett said to Calloway, with a venom that came out sharper than he likely intended. And in that single uncontrolled word, Clara heard the whole architecture of their arrangement, the purchased cooperation. The expectation of loyalty, the shock of finding that purchased loyalty had an exit price. Calloway's face closed, and Clara watched him make the calculation she'd predicted 2 nights ago at Nora's table, the wind direction calculation. The survival arithmetic of a man whose primary commitment was to his own continuance. I'll need to see the documentation of these alleged violations, Calloway said to Webb, in a tone that had shifted completely from the deference he'd shown Garrett. As the county's law enforcement, I want to be fully cooperative with any state inquiry. Garrett looked at him with an expression that could have started a fire. Clara almost felt something for Garrett in that moment, not sympathy. Nothing like it, but the distant and precise recognition of what it felt like to have your faith in someone's loyalty revealed as a transaction. She had lived in that feeling for 3 years. She did not enjoy seeing it on his face, but she recognized it, and that recognition was its own kind of dark education. Mr. Garrett, Webb said again, patient and immovable. Shall we go to my office? Garrett's attorneys exchanged a look. The older one put his hand on Garrett's arm, and Boyd Garrett, who had owned the grain warehouse and the livery and the county land board and the sheriff's conscience and 3 families' legacies and 2 years of Clara Whitfield's stolen property, said nothing. He turned his horse and rode toward town. and his attorneys rode beside him and Webb rode behind. And it was over in 45 seconds. Calloway was the last to go. He turned his horse and then stopped and looked at Clara. "I should have," he started. "Yes," she said, "you should have." He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he touched his hat, the old courtesy, automatic and insufficient and all he had, and rode after the rest of them. Thomas let out a breath beside her that sounded like it had been held since yesterday. The thing about a reckoning was that it didn't end cleanly. Clara knew this by noon, when the immediate electricity of the morning had settled into the longer and less dramatic work of what came after. Sutton was in Red Creek coordinating with Webb. Garrett was in custody on a preliminary charge while the full case was assembled, which Sutton said could take weeks. Harlan was in a county holding room, cooperating, which Webb said was the operative fact of his future, and which clarifies the specific emotional flatness of someone who has processed all the available feeling on a subject and come out the other side into something quieter. The house was hers. That much was immediate and concrete. Webb had issued a temporary protection order on the property pending the resolution of the state's case, which meant no one from Garrett's organization could touch it, file against it, or enter it without her permission. She stood in the main room of the house she'd been afraid in for 3 years, and tried to find the fear, and discovered it had burned down with the barn, or left with Harlan, or walked out of her on some dark road between Red Creek and Hargrove. The room was just a room. The house was just a structure. What made it worth keeping was what her father had put into the land underneath it. And that was still there. The survey stakes had seen to that. And the creek still ran, and the fruit trees were still standing in the south field exactly where her mother had planted them. She was standing at the window when Nora Pearce arrived. Thomas had gone back to his mother at first light, and now he came through the front door with Nora behind him. And Nora walked in the way she always walked, straight, deliberate, with the authority of a woman who moved through the world on her own terms. She looked at the room. She looked at Clara. She crossed the room in 6 steps and took Clara's face in both her hands and looked at her the way she might look at something she'd been worrying about, and had now finally found intact. She didn't say anything for a long moment. "You look terrible," Nora said at last. Clara laughed. It came out raw and surprising, the laugh of someone who hadn't expected to laugh again quite this soon. And once it started, it was difficult to stop, and Nora held her face and laughed too. And Thomas made the sound men made when the women in their lives laughed together at something he wasn't entirely part of, and he was quietly, visibly relieved by. "Your barn is gone," Nora said, when they'd both settled. "I know, your ribs are cracked. Probably you need a doctor. A meal and 12 hours of sleep in some order. The order can be negotiated," Clara said. Nora dropped her hands and looked past Clara's shoulder to where Caleb was standing in the doorway, between the main room and the kitchen. The same doorway he'd been standing in for most of the morning, close enough to be present, far enough to be decent. Nora looked at him with the particular assessment of a woman who had outlived 2 husbands and had therefore developed strong opinions about men. "You're the one who went into the barn with her," Nora said. "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said. "A beat." "Yes, ma'am." "Good," Nora said. "Men who aren't afraid of fire have no judgment." She looked at him a moment longer. "Thank you for coming when she needed someone to ride the same direction." Something shifted in Caleb's face, a small, genuine thing. "She didn't need much," he said. "She had most of it herself." "I know that," Nora said. "So do you. That's the point. The doctor came from Red Creek at 2, and confirmed 2 cracked ribs and a bruise across Clara's left side that made him look at her with the expression of a man who was making careful choices about what to say and what to document. He wrapped her ribs and told her not to lift anything heavy for 6 weeks, and looked at her with his pen over his notebook and said, "Mrs. Whitfield, I want to note these injuries, for the record." "Yes," she said. "Note them. All of them," he said, "including the ones from before last night." She looked at him. He was a young man, newer to Red Creek than most, And he had the particular quality of someone who had not yet been in one place long enough to learn which direction to look away in. She liked them, she said. Yes. When he was done and gone. She sat in her father's kitchen chair and ate the meal Nora had made from what remained in the larder. It wasn't much. But it was warm, and it was hers, and she felt the day settling over her like something being laid down after being carried too long. Nora sat across from her, and Thomas sat at the end of the table, and Caleb sat beside her. And they ate together in the kind of quiet that was not uncomfortable but companionable. The quiet of people who have been through something and don't need to talk about it because they were all there. "What happens to the land now?" Thomas asked eventually. "The transfers are frozen," Clara said. "The creek rights revert during the inquiry. The north pasture and the timber acreage will require a court order to restore formally. But Sutton says the evidence makes that straightforward. Just slow." She held her coffee cup in both hands. "Slow is all right. Slow means it's done correctly. And Garrett, the criminal charge is preliminary. Webb says there will be more." She paused. "And the Dunmores may get their land back. And possibly 2 other families." Thomas absorbed this. "One woman walked into a telegraph office," he said. "And it's unraveling 5 years of his operation." "One woman walked in 7 months ago," Clara said. "I walked in last night." The unraveling needed both. She thought about Margaret Dunmore in Austin, checking in with the land office every 2 weeks. She thought about an old woman's persistence meeting a young woman's desperation at the exact right moment on a telegraph wire, in a town neither of them had ever met in. She thought about how many things had to align, and how easily any one of them could have not aligned. And she put that thought away, because there was nothing useful to do with it. The things had aligned. You worked with what aligned. Caleb set his coffee down. "There's something I should tell you," he said, addressing the table rather than Clara specifically, with the tone of a man who has been carrying something and has decided the carrying is done. "My original plan when I came through Red Creek was to stay 2 days, document what I could on Garrett's operation, and pass it to a contact at the land office." He paused. "I had enough to file a report. I didn't have enough to make a case." He looked at Clara. "You had what I was missing. Your family's records. The original deed, the physical survey markers. Without what you walked out of that house with, without what you told me in the street," Clara said. "Sutton's name," he said. "That was all I gave you. You gave me direction," she said. "When I had none, that is not a small thing." She held his gaze. Because she was done minimizing what people had done for her. Done compressing acts of genuine help into smaller shapes so she wouldn't feel she owed too much. "It was not a small thing, Caleb." He looked at her steadily. "No," he said after a moment. "I suppose it wasn't." Nora, who had been watching this exchange with the alert stillness of a woman cataloging something for future reference, said nothing. But the expression on her face was the particular expression of someone who has correctly identified a situation and is choosing not to name it out loud because naming it will be premature, and Nora Pearce had never been premature about anything in 71 years of living. Late afternoon brought a rider from Sutton's office, a young clerk with a sealed envelope and the barely suppressed excitement of someone who had been allowed to carry important news for the first time. Clara broke the seal at the kitchen table, with Nora and Thomas and Caleb watching. The letter was 2 pages, detailed and precise, in Sutton's plain, clear hand. She read it once quickly, and then read it again slowly. Because the first time through, she wasn't sure she was understanding it correctly. She set it down. "Garrett's county contact," she said. "The person on the land board who buried the Dunmore complaint in March." She paused. It was Calloway. The kitchen went very quiet. "Not just compliance," she said. "Active participation. Webb found payments, a land board appointment Garrett arranged. Going back to 83. 4 years of buried complaints, missed documents, and at least one witness who was encouraged to leave the county before they could testify." She looked at the letter. Calloway didn't just look the other way. He was the other way. He tipped his hat to you when you left his office, Thomas said. His voice stripped down to something fundamental. He did, Clara said. And then he rode out to make sure Garrett knew the deed was in play. She thought about Calloway's office. The pipe tobacco smell, the boots up on the desk, the performance of a man too tired and too removed to engage, which had been a performance the whole time cover for someone who was very much engaged. Just on the wrong side. She thought about walking out of that office and deciding she would find someone who would help her. She thought about how close she'd come to going home instead. About how the whole shape of what had followed had hinged on not going home. On walking into the heat of that afternoon and meeting a stranger's eyes at a water trough. Calloway is being held, she said, reading the last line of Sutton's letter. As of 2 o'clock, Thomas sat back in his chair with the slow exhale of a man letting go of something he'd been braced against. Nora reached across the table and covered Clara's hand with hers and held it. Clara looked at the letter. She looked at the table. At the people around it. She looked at the window and the land beyond it. The land her father had built and her mother had loved, and that she had nearly lost and had not lost. Had refused to lose, had walked through fire literal and otherwise to hold. It's not finished, she said. The case takes months. The court orders, the formal restrictions, it's not finished. No, Caleb said. But it's turned. She looked at him. He was right. That was the precise word for it. Not one, not yet, but turn. The direction of everything had changed. The current that had been running against her for 2 years, for 3 years, had reversed its flow, and she was no longer swimming against it but moving with it. And there was a difference between those two experiences that her whole body knew. Her cracked ribs and her steady hands and the deep exhaustion that was starting. Finally to feel like the good kind. Turned, she said. He nodded. She looked at the letter once more, then folded it and set it beside the survey posts, which were leaning against the kitchen wall where she'd put them this morning. Their markers intact, her father's handwriting on the stakes as clear and legible as the day he'd made them. As permanent as the land they described. Then she looked out at the south field, where her mother's trees were standing in the late afternoon light. And she thought, tomorrow she would walk out there. She would put her hand on the bark of the biggest one, the one her mother was buried under, and she would say out loud, in her own voice, what she should have said a long time ago. That she was still here, that the land was still here. That no one, not Harlan, not Garrett, not Calloway, not the whole accumulated weight of everyone who had ever looked at her and decided before she opened her mouth what she was worth had taken either of those things from her. She was still here. Tomorrow she would say it. Tonight she sat in her father's kitchen with people who had stood beside her, and she let herself be warm and fed and tired in the right way, and for the first time in 3 years she did not count anything at all. She went to her mother's tree the next morning, the way she'd promised herself she would. The fruit trees in the south field had not cared about Boyd Garrett or forged deeds or men with matches. They had continued doing what fruit trees did, growing, putting out leaves, preparing their slow seasonal abundance with the absolute indifference of living things that understand time differently than people do. The biggest one, the apple tree her mother had planted the spring, after her father broke ground on the original homestead, stood exactly where it had always stood, its bark thick and furrowed, its roots deep enough that no drought or fraud or human failing had been able to touch them. Clara put her hand on it. She didn't say anything for a long moment. She just stood there in the early morning with her cracked ribs wrapped tight and her hand on her mother's tree. And she let herself be in the specific silence of that place, the silence of something that had been here before her and would be here after, that had witnessed everything and held its counsel. Then she said, out loud in her own voice, I'm still here. It's still ours. The words were smaller than she'd expected and truer than she'd expected, which was how the most important things usually worked. She stayed there for 10 minutes. She did not cry. though she had thought she might. What she felt was not grief and not relief, but something that contained both of them, and was larger than either the specific feeling of a person who has come back to something after being away so long they weren't sure they'd find it, and has found it waiting. She walked back to the house, and Caleb was on the porch with 2 cups of coffee, and he handed her one without comment, and they stood together in the early light and drank it. And neither of them felt the need to fill the silence. Because the silence was good. Sutton sent word, Caleb said eventually. The preliminary hearing for Garrett is set for Friday in Hargrove. Webb wants you there. I'll be there, she said. He also says the land board has suspended its operations pending review of all transactions from the last 5 years. Caleb turned the cup in his hands. 3 other families are being contacted, people who lost property in Garrett's operation. Clara thought about those families. She thought about the specific texture of losing something you'd built. She understood it differently now than she would have 3 days ago. Understood it not as an abstract injustice but as a personal anatomy. The way it sat in your chest and restructured everything around it. Margaret Dunmore, she said. Has anyone told her? Sutton wired Austin this morning, Caleb said. Webb's office is notifying her directly. Clara looked at the south field. At the trees. She thought about an old woman checking in at a land office every 2 weeks for 7 months and being told every time that the matter was under consideration, that these things took time, that she should be patient. She thought about what that kind of patience cost. She thought about how that patience had, without Margaret Dunmore ever knowing it, kept a door cracked open that Garrett's money and Calloway's corruption had almost completely closed. I'd like to write to her, Clara said. Caleb looked at her. Margaret Dunmore. I want her to know that her complaint mattered. That it wasn't lost, that it connected to something. She held her coffee cup. She deserves to know that someone on the other end of that wire was real. You barely know her name, Caleb said. Not as an objection, but as an observation. She barely knew mine, Clara said. And what she did still saved my land. You don't have to know someone for what they did to matter. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, no, you don't. She looked at him then directly. The way she'd been doing it her whole life before she'd married Harlan and learned to look sideways, and she said what she'd been turning over since the previous afternoon. The thing that had been sitting in the space between them, like something that deserved naming. You said you adjusted your route, she said, to go through Hargrove. I did, he said. What were you going to do if I hadn't come out of that sheriff's office? He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Keep watching, he said. Keep building what I could. Pass it to Carver's office when I had enough, a pause. It wasn't enough. I had pattern evidence, but nothing primary. Nothing that could anchor a case. So you needed me, she said. I needed what you had, he said, which is different from needing you. Though I understand why you'd want to draw that line carefully. She did understand why she wanted to draw it carefully. She had spent 3 years being needed in ways that had nothing to do with her, as a person needed as a legal name, as a transfer mechanism, as a body to be managed. She was learning, slowly and not without some difficulty, the difference between being used and being useful, and between being needed for what you carried and being wanted for who you were. I'm going to draw it carefully, she said. For a while yet. That's reasonable, he said. It might take some time. I've got time, he said. And his voice was simple and steady and not pressuring her toward anything. And she believed him, and that belief, the ability to receive a plain statement at face value without running it through 3 layers of threat assessment, was itself something new. Something she was practicing, something she intended to keep practicing, until it came as naturally as breathing. All right, she said. All right, he agreed. They finished their coffee. The morning moved forward the way mornings did, indifferent to the enormity of the nights that preceded them. Friday came with the weather finally breaking. The oppressive August heat releasing into something that felt, for the first time in weeks, like the possibility of autumn. The Hargrove Courthouse was a two-story building with more official gravity than the town itself quite justified. And by the time Clara arrived with Sutton and Caleb and Thomas and Nora, who had made it clear that no preliminary hearing in the county of which she was a 40-year resident was going to occur without her physical presence, the courthouse steps already had more people on them than Clara had expected. She stopped when she saw them. Not Garrett's people. Not lawyers, not officials. Families. She recognized some of them faces she'd seen at the edge of things. The Halverson boy whose father's farm had gone under 2 years ago. Mrs. Creddy, who had lost her late husband's grazing rights in what everyone had been told was a routine legal dispute. She recognized others by the particular quality of how they were standing. The grouped posture of people who have come somewhere together because someone told them their story might finally be summoned into. Sutton, she said quietly. Webb's office contacted them, Sutton said. Equally quiet, watching the steps. They were asked if they wanted to observe the preliminary hearing. As potential additional complainants. He paused. I don't think any of us anticipated quite this many. How many? Caleb asked. 11 families, Sutton said. That 11 families. 5 years of Garrett's operation spread across 11 families. Which meant 11 sets of decisions made in fear or desperation or ignorance of what was actually being done to them. 11 private griefs that had existed in the isolation that Garrett's machine had relied on because isolated people couldn't compare notes. Couldn't see the pattern, couldn't find each other at the bottom of the same hole, and realize it hadn't been an accident. Clara walked up the courthouse steps. She walked past the families and she did not look away from anyone and she did not hurry. And halfway up the steps a woman she didn't know reached out and briefly touched her arm, not stopping her. Not making a thing of it, just a touch. The specific gesture of one person telling another person, I know what this is and I am here too. Clara put her hand over the woman's for half a second. Then she went inside. The preliminary hearing lasted 4 hours and Clara testified for 40 minutes of them. And when it was over, Boyd Garrett had been formally charged with land fraud, conspiracy, and bribery of a county official, and his 2 senior attorneys had spent most of the 4 hours looking at each other with the expression of men who were recalculating their own professional futures. Garrett himself said very little. He had arrived that morning with the composed expression of a man who still believed the situation was manageable, who had weathered legal challenges before and understood them as problems that money solved. By the second hour, something in his composure had begun to develop cracks, small ones. Hairline, but Clara, who had spent 3 years studying the fine grain of a man's controlled surface for signs of what was underneath, could see them clearly. The moment the cracks became visible to everyone in the room was when Webb read Harlan's statement into the record. Not because of what the statement said about the land transfers, those facts had already been established, but because of the first paragraph, which Harlan had apparently added without prompting, which described in plain language the original conversation between Garrett and Harlan's father, in which Garrett had identified Clara's family as a target specifically because, and Harlan had recorded the exact words, a woman on her own with a sick father, and nothing but her land was the easiest kind of problem to solve permanently. The nothing but her land. As if the land were the consolation prize for a life that hadn't amounted to anything. Clara sat in the gallery and heard those words and felt them move through her like cold water, and then felt something else rise up behind them, not rage. She was past the hot stage of this, but a clear and absolute refusal. A refusal that had started 2 mornings ago with her hand on a forged deed and had been building itself, layer by layer, into something structural. She had not been nothing but her land. She had been the person who knew every acre of it by heart, who had fought for it in a burning barn, who had walked into a telegraph office and sent the wire that connected 2 ends of a case Garrett had spent years keeping separate, who had stood in her own doorway and said no with a voice that didn't shake. The land was hers because she was worth keeping it. Not the other way around. She sat with that understanding as Webb finished reading, and it settled into her the way true things settled, not with drama, but with the quiet permanence of something that had finally found the right place. It was on the courthouse steps afterward, in the autumn-feeling air, that she met Margaret Dunmore. She hadn't known the old woman was there. Webb hadn't mentioned it. But when Clara came out of the courthouse doors and the afternoon light hit her face, a small woman in a gray dress was standing at the bottom of the steps, looking up at her with the direct, unhurried gaze of someone who had been waiting a specific length of time for a specific thing and had decided the waiting was done. Clara stopped. She looked at the woman. She looked at the age in her face, the road in it, the particular kind of tired that came from fighting something for a long time, without knowing if you were winning. She walked down the steps. "Mrs. Dunmore," she said. "Mrs. Whitfield," the old woman said. Her voice was stronger than her frame suggested. "I got the wire from Sutton's office yesterday morning. I drove through the night." She looked at Clara with those direct eyes. "I wanted to see the woman who finished what I started." "You started something that saved my land," Clara said. "I want you to know that. What you did in March, filing that complaint, when the county had already buried everything, when no one was listening, it kept the door open. Without that, there was no case. Without that, I had nothing to connect to." Margaret Dunmore looked at her for a long moment. Her eyes, Clara noticed, were the specific quality of old grief and old determination, mixed together the look of a woman who has carried both for so long they'd become indistinguishable. "My son built that ranch," the old woman said. "My husband and 40 years. My grandchildren were born there." She stopped. "Garrett's man told us the deed was invalid, just like that. As if 40 years of building something could be made invalid by a piece of paper a man with money had arranged." Her jaw was steady. "I went to every county office in the territory. They all pointed me elsewhere. Eventually, someone in Austin listened long enough to take a record. And I thought maybe nothing will come of it. Maybe it's too small. Maybe one old woman's complaint doesn't count for much." She looked at Clara. "But I thought if I don't say it, who does?" Clara felt the back of her eyes burn for the second time in 2 days, and this time she didn't push it away. "It counted," she said. "It counted more than you know." Margaret Dunmore reached out and took both of Clara's hands in hers. Her hands were the same kind of hands Clara's mother had weathered. Capable, the hands of a woman who had worked land and loved it. She held them for a moment. "You get it back," she said. "You hear me? You keep every acre. And you get yours back too," Clara said. "Sutton says the Dunmore transfer is one of the clearest cases. It will be one of the first restorations." The old woman closed her eyes for 1 second. Just one. Then she opened them and nodded once, sharp and definitive, and released Clara's hands. Caleb was standing 3 steps behind Clara. He had been there the whole time, and she hadn't heard him arrive. And when Margaret Dunmore looked past her and saw him, something extraordinary happened on the old woman's face. The grief in it opened up and then closed again around something warmer. Something that had clearly been looking for somewhere to put itself. "You," Margaret Dunmore said. Caleb stepped forward. "Mrs. Dunmore." His voice had a quality Clara had not heard in it before younger. "Somehow, raw, I left before it happened. I didn't know until I was 3 counties away. And by then you couldn't have changed it," the old woman said firmly. "I know that. I've always known that." She looked at him with the precision of someone who has thought very carefully about a thing and arrived at a conclusion they trust. "But you didn't forget us." "No, ma'am," he said. "I did not." She looked at him and then at Clara and then back at him. And the expression on her face was the expression of a woman who has seen enough of the world to recognize when something is becoming what it is meant to become. Even if the becoming isn't finished yet. "Good," she said. With finality. She adjusted her gloves. "Now someone find me a place to eat. I drove all night and I am hungry." Thomas, who had been standing to Clara's left and managing his emotions about the entire scene with the visible effort of a man raised not to cry in public, said, "Yes, ma'am," immediately and with such decisive relief at having a practical task that everyone around him almost laughed. The weeks that followed were not easy. But they were real, which was better than easy had ever been. The formal restoration of the creek rights came through in the third week of September, a court order, signed and sealed, reversing the fraudulent transfer and returning the water rights to the Whitfield deed. Sutton brought it out to the ranch himself and laid it on the kitchen table, and Clara read it twice, and then put it with her father's original grant deed in the tin box she'd found in the floor of the main room, under the board her father had always stepped around, where he'd kept the documents that mattered most. She'd always wondered why he stepped around that board. Now she understood that too. The North Pasture restoration followed in October. The timber acreage was still in process, more complicated, more contested, requiring additional court filings, but Sutton said by spring, and she believed him, because Sutton was a man who said what he meant and meant what he said. And she was rebuilding her understanding of what that looked like in a person. Garrett's trial was set for the following February. Calloway had taken a plea arrangement in exchange for his testimony, which Sutton said was the right legal outcome even if it wasn't the satisfying one. And Clara had thought about that for 2 days before deciding that satisfying outcomes were for stories and real outcomes were for life, and that a compromised sheriff testifying against a land fraud operation was more useful to the families who needed restitution than a satisfying sentence was to her personally. She told Caleb this one evening. He looked at her for a moment and said, "When did you get so pragmatic?" "I think I always was," she said. "I just spent 3 years being told I was too much of everything else to be pragmatic on top of it." He shook his head, slightly, not disagreement. Something else. The particular movement a person made when they encountered something that struck them as both sad and true. "I want to tell you something," he said. They were on the porch. The evening cool now, with October well established. The stars coming out with the sharpness they had in fall. She turned to face him. "When I first came through Red Creek," he said, "I was looking for evidence. That was all I was doing. I told myself it was about the Dunmores, about finishing something I felt I'd walked away from." He paused. "And that was true. But it's not all of what's true. What's the rest of it?" she asked. He looked at the dark field, at the trees she'd told him about, which he couldn't see in the dark, but which were there. He looked at the house behind them, lit warm from inside, where Nora was teaching Thomas's younger brother how to play cards and losing deliberately because she liked the boy. "I watched you walk out of Calloway's office," he said, "with something broken on your face and something unbroken in your eyes. And I thought that is someone who hasn't given up, even though they have every reason to. And I thought I'd like to know a person like that." He paused. "More than I thought I'd like most things." Clara looked at him. She held what he'd said, in the way she held important things now, carefully, without immediate reaction, giving it room to be what it was before she decided what to do with it. "I'm not finished," she said, "with the healing, with the learning, with figuring out what I actually want versus what I was told to want." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to be finished. I'm going to make decisions you won't agree with," she said. "About the land, about the ranch, about what I build here." "I expect so," he said. "I'll probably have opinions. I'll probably disagree with some of them." "Probably," he agreed. And the ghost of that almost smile was there again. "I can live with that." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the water trough and the scrap of paper with Sutton's name. She thought about the road to Hargrove and of a telegraph machine chattering in the dark. She thought about a burning barn and 2 fence posts and a woman in Austin who checked in every 2 weeks and never gave up. She thought about all the things that had to be true at once for her to be standing here, the specific and unlikely geometry of it, the improbable chain of events that had required everyone involved to be exactly who they were at exactly the right moment. "I can live with that too," she said. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise of something that wasn't ready to be promised yet. It was two people choosing, carefully, and with full knowledge of what choosing cost, to be in the same direction. That was enough. That was, in fact, exactly right. She built the new barn in November. She hired 4 men from the town, and she worked beside them. And the people of Red Creek who came past on the main road and saw Clara Whitfield in work clothes, with sawdust in her hair and her sleeves rolled up, did not laugh. A few of them stopped. A few of them asked if she needed help. Some of them she accepted and some she declined, and all of it she did on her own terms, which was the only way she intended to do anything from here forward. Priscilla Hadley came past on a Tuesday and stopped her horse and looked at the rising frame of the new barn and looked at Clara and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "That's coming up fast." "Good workers," Clara said. Another pause. "I heard what Garrett's man said. In the courthouse." The nothing but her land. Priscilla's voice had a quality Clara hadn't heard in it before, something stripped of the social performance. Something more direct. "I want you to know that she stopped. Started again. I am not proud of how this town treated you." Clara looked at her. She thought about the day outside the dry goods store. The deliberately audible whispers, the specific cruelty of a pretty woman using her prettiness to draw blood. She thought about what Nora had told her, that people did what they knew how to do with what they had, and that knowing something different was possible was only useful when you actually knew it. "I know," Clara said, "and now you know something different." Priscilla held her gaze and then nodded. Once, with the seriousness of someone accepting a responsibility. She rode on. Clara watched her go and turned back to the barn frame and picked up her hammer. The letter from Margaret Dunmore arrived in early December. On a cold, clear morning with the first real frost glittering on the south field. It was 2 pages in a handwriting that was strong and angular and wasted no space, which was exactly what Clara had expected. Margaret wrote that the Dunmore land restoration was proceeding, that her grandson had cried when he was told, that she herself had not cried, because she had spent 7 months being certain the outcome was coming, and had been saving the crying for something that surprised her. And the restoration had not surprised her. She had never genuinely believed it would not happen, even in the worst of the months when every county door was closed. She wrote, "I have been thinking about what you said on the courthouse steps, that what I did counted. I want you to know that I have thought about those words every day since, and I believe them now in a way I did not allow myself to believe them before. An old woman can do a remarkable amount of damage to a corrupt man's plans when she simply refuses to accept that she's irrelevant. I recommend this approach." Clara read that paragraph twice and then read it to Caleb, who was at the kitchen table with the property survey he'd been helping her update for the timber acreage filing. He listened and then said, "She's right." "She is," Clara said. "It's also good advice for non-old women," he said. "I noticed that," Clara said. She folded the letter and put it in the tin box with the deeds and the court orders and her father's original grant and the scrap of paper with Sutton Hargrove written in plain, clear handwriting that she had kept, for reasons she hadn't examined too carefully, since the first morning of everything. The tin box was getting full. She thought her father would have liked that. It was Thomas who said it, finally. On a Sunday afternoon in January, when the Pearce family had come for dinner, and the kitchen was loud and warm, and full of the overlapping noise of people who were comfortable enough together to talk over each other. He said it quietly, when he and Clara happened to be alone in the kitchen for a moment, while the others were in the main room. "You know what's different about you," he said. She looked up from the bread she was slicing. "What?" "You don't apologize anymore," he said, "for taking up space, for having an opinion, for being in the room." He said it carefully, as if he'd been saving it. "You used to do that. I didn't notice it until you stopped." Clara held the bread knife and thought about that. She thought about all the reflexive apologies, the constant small genuflections, to the idea that her presence was an imposition, her opinion an intrusion, her body an inconvenience. She thought about how long they'd been so automatic she hadn't known they were happening. "I'm learning to stop," she said. "It's working," Thomas said. He went back to the main room, and Clara stood in the kitchen for a moment, with the bread knife in her hand, and the tin box on the shelf, and the sound of people she loved being loud and warm in the next room. She was 23 years old. She had cracked ribs that were healed now. Mostly. She had 320 acres of her father's land and her mother's trees and a new barn still smelling of fresh timber. She had a court case proceeding in her favor, and an attorney who answered her letters within 2 days, and an old woman in Austin who had recommended, from experience, refusing to accept irrelevance. She had a man who had adjusted his route and stayed. She had herself, which she was relearning the dimensions of not the self that had been compressed and diminished and taught to disappear, but the self underneath that, the one that had known every acre of the land by heart, and walked into a burning building and stood in a doorway and said no. That self had been there the whole time. She had just needed to stop counting the wrong things long enough to find her. Clara Whitfield set the bread knife down. She straightened her spine deliberately. Consciously, the way she was still sometimes having to remind herself to do. She picked up the bread and carried it into the room full of people who knew her and liked her and were loudly, impractically present in her life. She set it on the table and sat down and took up her full share of the room. Her full share of the warmth and the noise and the particular irreplaceable weight of being alive and intact in a life that belonged to no one but herself. And that every hard mile of it, every dark night and burning barn and telegraph wire and courthouse, step and mother's tree and border of land, held against every force that tried to take it, that was not a story about a woman who had been rescued. That was a story about a woman who had rescued herself, and in doing so, had made room for everything worth having to finally walk through the door.